Leonardo DiCaprio had spent the day in meetings, buried under a pile of scripts and investment pitches, none of which had excited him. It was one of those exhausting afternoons in New York, when the city buzzed with energy, but he felt utterly drained by it. He had just left a production house meeting and, against his usual habits, decided to indulge in something simple and familiar: a McDonald's. It was a small, crowded one near Times Square, filled with tourists, workers on their break, and kids still in their school uniforms. Hardly the kind of place where you'd expect to run into one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. But Leo was good at blending in, hood up, sunglasses on, a slight slouch to his posture. He was a man who had mastered the art of being invisible when he wanted to be. He ordered a simple meal, a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke, and found a quiet corner near the window. He wasn't looking for attention, wasn't looking for anything, really. Just a moment to himself, a taste of something familiar, before he disappeared back into the luxury of his life. Then, a voice. Small, hesitant. "Excuse me, sir?" Leo turned his head slightly. A boy, no older than 10, stood beside his table. His dark brown hair was messy, his clothes slightly oversized as if they'd been picked up at a thrift store. His hands were clenched at his sides, as if he was working up the courage to say something important. Leo expected the usual, an autograph request, maybe a shy, "Are you really Leonardo DiCaprio?" Instead, the boy leaned in, just enough that his next words sent a chill down the actor's spine. "They took my sister. Please help me." Leo's grip on his burger froze mid-air. He looked around. No cameras, no prying eyes. Just a scared kid with an urgent whisper, looking up at him like he was his only hope. The actor had spent years perfecting his ability to fake emotions on screen, but this was real. And something about the boy's wide, panicked eyes told him this wasn't some prank or an overeager fan playing games. Leo swallowed hard. "What did you just say?" The boy's voice dropped lower. His lips barely moved. "They took her. A man in a black car. I don't know what to do." Leo wasn't sure if it was adrenaline, instinct, or something deeper, but he felt his entire body go cold. He set his food down, straightened his posture. "Who took her?" he asked, his voice firm. The boy looked toward the door, as if afraid someone might be watching. His small fingers gripped the edge of the table. "The man in the parking lot. He said he knew my mom, but she told me never to talk to strangers. I tried to stop him, but she's gone." Leo's mind was racing. He glanced out the window toward the McDonald's parking lot, his heart pounding. Then he saw it. A black SUV, idling near the entrance. He didn't think. He acted. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. And then, as the line connected, he realized something chilling. The SUV's tinted window was rolling down, and someone inside was looking right at him. Leo felt the phone slick in his palm, his heart hammering against his ribs as he kept his eyes locked on the SUV. The back window had lowered just enough to reveal the shadowy outline of someone inside, but not enough for him to see a face. The air in the McDonald's felt suddenly too thick, the bright fluorescent lights almost sterile against the panic rising in his throat. He pressed the phone to his ear, steadying his breath as the dispatcher answered. 911. "What's your emergency?" Leo didn't hesitate, keeping his voice low but firm. "I'm at the McDonald's on 46th and 8th. A kid here says his sister was taken by a man in a black SUV. The vehicle is still outside." The boy tugged at Leo's sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. "They see you," he said, eyes darting between Leo and the window. Leo saw it too. The SUV had started moving, inching forward like a predator deciding whether or not to strike. The moment stretched unbearably thin, every nerve in his body screaming at him to do something before that car disappeared. "Sir, do you have a license plate number?" the dispatcher asked. Leo cursed under his breath. "Not yet. They're pulling away." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the tile, making a few nearby customers glance in his direction. He didn't care. The boy was frozen in place, fists clenched at his sides, his small chest rising and falling too fast, too shallow, like he was about to hyperventilate. Leo's hand found his shoulder, not gripping hard, but enough to ground him. "Stay with me, okay?" The boy nodded, though his eyes were still locked on the SUV. Leo started toward the glass door, phone still to his ear, ignoring the voice in his head telling him he was an idiot for getting involved like this. The SUV was nearing the parking lot exit, the brake lights flashing for a second before they hesitated at the red light ahead. A chance, maybe the only one. The car's turning onto 8th. "I can see the plate, New York. Starts with HFN." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, steady. "Keep your distance, sir." Officers are on the way. What does the suspect look like? Leo's stomach clenched. I don't know yet. The windows are tinted. The SUV suddenly lurched forward, cutting into traffic and running the light. Leo caught the full plate just as it disappeared into the mess of cabs and buses. He rattled it off quickly, fingers gripping the phone tighter than he realized. Officers are en route, the dispatcher assured him. Can you describe the child who was taken? Leo looked down at the boy. He was staring at the door, hands balled into fists, his whole body tense like a wire about to snap. His lips pressed together, but when Leo motioned to the phone, he finally spoke, his voice barely holding together. Her name is Lila. She's 6. She was wearing a pink jacket and black sneakers. She has a Hello Kitty Band-Aid on her hand. His voice cracked. I tried to stop him. The weight of those last words hit harder than Leo expected. He could see the guilt, the anger, the sheer helplessness on the kid's face. He had done everything a 10-year-old could, and it hadn't been enough. Leo turned back to the phone. Did you get that? Yes, sir. Officers are searching the area. Stay put until they arrive. Leo exhaled slowly, forcing his pulse to steady. He glanced around the McDonald's, realizing for the first time that people were watching. A few employees near the register whispered among themselves. An older woman near the soda machine looked on with quiet concern, her cup paused mid-fill. No one had approached, but he could feel the shift in the room. He crouched down, lowering himself to the boy's height. What's your name? The kid hesitated, glancing at the door again before answering. Ethan. Okay, Ethan. The police are coming. They're going to find her. Ethan didn't respond right away, his small hands gripping the hem of his hoodie so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, finally, he whispered. He said he knew her mom. Leo frowned. The man who took her? Ethan nodded. We were waiting for her. She was inside the laundromat next door. She told us to wait outside, just for a minute. He came up and said she asked him to pick us up. His breath hitched. Lila believed him. Leo felt something tighten in his chest. A laundromat. A busy street. A 6-year-old trusting a stranger because he knew the right words to say. It was every nightmare scenario played out in broad daylight. Did you see his face? Ethan shook his head. He had a hat on. And sunglasses. He wasn't old, though. Not like a grandpa. Leo absorbed that, his mind already turning over possibilities. This wasn't a random snatching. This man had planned, had watched. Maybe even knew their routine. The police arrived 5 minutes later, 2 officers stepping through the glass doors, their presence shifting the entire mood of the restaurant. The tension in the air thickened, and Leo saw the moment Ethan spotted their uniforms. He stiffened, eyes flickering with something raw and unfiltered. Fear. One officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a firm but calm voice, crouched down to Ethan's level. Hey, buddy. I'm Officer Ramirez. We're going to find your sister, okay? But I need you to tell me everything you remember. Leo stepped back as Ethan nodded and started speaking again, this time a little steadier. He stayed close, though, listening, absorbing every detail. He had no reason to be involved beyond this point, no obligation. But when he glanced at Ethan's face, at the barely contained terror and the way his small fingers gripped the fabric of his hoodie like a lifeline, Leo knew he wasn't walking away. The officer stood and turned to him. You were the one who called? Leo nodded. She studied him for a moment, then said, The plate you gave us, it's a rental. We're checking with the company now, but no one matching the suspect's description rented it under their own name. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. Leo clenched his jaw. It was planned. The officer nodded. Which means whoever took her knew where to find them. Leo exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure why, but that made it worse. Ethan turned to him suddenly, his voice small but firm. You're not leaving, right? Leo looked down at him, at the way his wide, desperate eyes searched for something solid to hold on to. No, Leo said. I'm not leaving. Ethan hadn't moved from Leo's side, his small frame rigid with a tension that didn't belong to a 10-year-old. The officers were asking him more questions, but his hands stayed clenched in his hoodie, his voice flat as if he had locked away whatever panic was threatening to take over. Leo understood that feeling. He had seen it before, not just in movies, but in real life, in people who had learned too young that sometimes the world didn't care if you were a kid. He stayed close, listening, watching the way Ethan's gaze darted to the restaurant doors every few seconds, as if expecting something or someone to appear. The officers were professional, but Leo could tell they were working against time, measuring their words carefully to avoid setting off a reaction that would slow things down. Ethan swallowed hard before answering the next question, his voice quieter than before. He was tall. Not huge, but not short. He had on a Yankees hat. Black sunglasses. He smelled like, I don't know, like a car. He hesitated, shaking his head like he wasn't sure if that was even worth mentioning. But Ramirez, the female officer, nodded. Like gasoline? Like cigarettes? Ethan's fingers twitched against his hoodie, then he nodded slowly. Yeah, like gas. But something else too. Like those trees people hang in cars. Leo's jaw tightened, something clicking into place in his mind. He knew that smell. Not just the fresh pine air fresheners, but the way it mixed with gasoline, leather, the artificial clean scent people used to mask something else. Rental cars had that same mix, especially when they'd been driven a lot, cycled through too many hands, barely cleaned before the next driver got in. It wasn't much, but it was a detail, and details mattered. Ramirez took down notes, nodding as she exchanged a glance with her partner. Okay, that helps. Did he have an accent? Did he say anything besides telling Lila that your mom sent him? Ethan pressed his lips together for a long moment. Leo thought maybe he wouldn't answer, but then, barely above a whisper, he said, your mom's waiting. Let's go, kiddo. Something in Leo's stomach twisted. Kiddo. The kind of casual, practiced familiarity that people use to get a child to trust them in an instant. Whoever this man was, he had planned this well. Ramirez nodded again. Okay, that's good. That helps us. She turned to Leo, her expression shifting slightly. You saw the car. You got the plate. You have a better sense of direction than most people. Any chance you noticed a partial description on the driver? Leo thought back to that moment, the dark SUV rolling forward, the slow movement of the window lowering just enough to reveal the vague outline of a face. He hadn't seen enough. Just a shadow, maybe the hint of a sharp jawline, but no defining features. Still, something had felt off in that moment, like the driver had been watching him specifically, waiting to see what he would do. He ran through it again in his head, trying to pull out anything useful. Not much. Male. Didn't look too old. Maybe mid-30s or 40s at most. Dark hair, but I couldn't see if it was short or long. Sunglasses. I think he was waiting to see if someone would react. He wasn't rushing, he was testing. Ramirez absorbed that, her fingers tapping once against her notepad before she turned back to Ethan. Your mom, does she have any family in the area? Any friends who would come to pick you up without her telling you first? Ethan shook his head. No, it's just us. No one else. His voice was flat again, a quiet, factual kind of certainty that made Leo's stomach knot even more. Ramirez's partner, a stocky man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense stance, spoke up. We have officers going to the rental agency now. If the car was taken under a fake name, we might still be able to track down surveillance footage, security deposits, anything that points us to the suspect. But in the meantime, we need to talk to Ethan's mom. The minute those words left his mouth, Ethan's head snapped up, his shoulders suddenly rigid. Leo didn't miss the way his fingers twisted tighter in his hoodie, his breath hitching for the first time since he had started answering questions. Ramirez must have caught it too, because she crouched slightly, keeping her voice steady. Ethan, do you know where your mom is right now? Ethan hesitated. His gaze flickered toward the door again, but this time it was different. He wasn't waiting. He was bracing for something. Leo didn't know what yet, but the second the boy spoke, he understood. She should be here, Ethan whispered. She should have come out by now. Leo and Ramirez exchanged a look. The laundromat. She had gone inside, left the kids outside for only a minute. Long enough for Lila to be taken. But why hadn't she come rushing out when she realized her daughter was missing? Ramirez's partner was already on his radio, relaying the new information, requesting officers to check the laundromat immediately. Leo wasn't waiting for the response. He turned to Ethan, speaking evenly. Where is it? Ethan motioned toward the door, and without another word, Leo started moving. He heard Ramirez call after him, but he didn't slow down. It was less than 50 feet away, just around the corner of the building. The glass windows were fogged slightly from the humidity inside, the hum of industrial dryers vibrating through the floor as Leo pushed open the door. The fluorescent lighting cast a dull, yellow tint over the room. There were only two other people inside, an older man pulling clothes from a dryer and a woman scrolling through her phone near a laundry cart. Neither of them looked remotely concerned. Leo's eyes moved fast, scanning for anyone who matched the description of Ethan's mother. Then he saw her. A woman slumped against the plastic chairs near the back, her dark hair falling over her face, her posture too still. A small laundry basket sat at her feet, clothes half-folded, like she had stopped in the middle of it and never moved again. Leo took a step forward, but something about the scene made him pause. He could see the slow rise and fall of her chest. She was breathing, but she wasn't waking up. His gut told him before his mind could catch up. Something was wrong. And then he saw it. The small, empty vial near her foot. Leo didn't waste a second. He moved toward the woman, his pulse hammering against his ribs as he crouched down beside her. Up close, he could see her eyelids fluttering, her breathing shallow but steady. She wasn't unconscious, but she was barely holding on. He reached out, hesitated for a split second before gently shaking her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. He glanced at the small vial on the floor and felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Someone had drugged her. It wasn't an overdose, not something she had taken willingly. This was controlled, measured, meant to incapacitate just long enough for someone to do what they needed to do. He turned his head sharply toward the door as Ramirez and her partner rushed in. The second Ramirez's eyes landed on the woman, she was already reaching for her radio. "We need paramedics at the laundromat on 46th and 8th. Possible drugging victim, semi-conscious, stable vitals." She lowered the radio, kneeling beside Leo, her voice calmer than the urgency in her eyes. "You found her like this?" She wasn't moving, breathing, but out of it. Leo gestured toward the vial, his fingers curling into a fist as he forced himself to stay focused. Someone drugged her. Whoever took Lila didn't want her interfering. Ramirez's partner was already stepping back toward the door, scanning the street outside as he spoke into his own radio, giving updates to the officers tracking the SUV. Leo barely registered it, his focus locked on the woman, on the way her fingers twitched slightly against the fabric of her jeans, like she was trying to move but couldn't. He leaned in, speaking low. "Ethan's safe. He's okay. But Lila..." The woman inhaled sharply, her body tensing for the first time since he had found her. Her eyes struggled to open, unfocused and hazy, but the second the words registered, her entire face changed. "Lila." Her voice was barely more than a breath, but it was laced with panic. Leo nodded quickly. "She was taken. The police are looking for her. Ethan's with me." The woman tried to sit up, but her limbs didn't fully cooperate. Her breath hitched, her hands gripping the chair for support as frustration twisted her face. No. Ramirez put a steady hand on her shoulder, keeping her from collapsing forward. "Ma'am, I know this is a lot, but we need to know everything. Did you see who did this?" She squeezed her eyes shut, swallowing hard before forcing them open again, trying to push through the fog in her system. Her voice was stronger this time, but still uneven. I was folding clothes. He came in behind me. I thought he was just another customer. Next thing I knew, something was covering my mouth, and her head tilted slightly, her brows furrowing. There was a smell. Chemical. Sweet. Then everything went blurry. Chloroform. Or something close to it. Leo clenched his jaw, the pieces falling into place too easily. They hadn't just been watching the kids. They had been watching her too, waiting for the right moment, making sure she couldn't fight back. Ramirez nodded, keeping her voice measured. "Did you get a look at him?" The woman took a shaky breath, her fingers pressing against her temples as if trying to force her brain to work faster. He was tall, maybe 6 feet. Black hoodie. I saw his hands, tattoos. A snake on his wrist. Leo barely noticed Ramirez relaying the details into her radio. His mind was already running, replaying Ethan's description of the man. Tall, Yankees hat, black sunglasses. It wasn't much, but the tattoo was something specific, something traceable. The woman's breath was quickening, panic breaking through the remnants of the drug as she tried to push herself upright again. "My baby. Where is my baby? Where's Ethan?" Leo stood immediately. "He's in McDonald's. He's safe." She nodded, exhaling in a shudder, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. She turned to Ramirez, her voice desperate. "Whoever did this, they knew what they were doing. This wasn't random. They knew I'd be alone. They knew my kids would be outside. They didn't just take her." Her hands curled into fists. "They came for her." Leo felt those words settle into the pit of his stomach like lead. Not a random abduction. Targeted. Planned. Ramirez's partner stepped back inside, his expression tight. The SUV was dumped 10 blocks from here, near a construction site. Engine still warm, doors open. No sign of the girl. The woman made a sound between a sob and a curse, her hands gripping her arms like she was trying to hold herself together. Leo's fists clenched at his sides. He had been in enough films to know what happened in cases like this when time was wasted. The police were doing their job, but every second lost was another mile between Lila and safety. Ramirez pressed her lips together, glancing between the woman and her partner. They switched cars. This was a handoff. Leo already knew what she was thinking. The SUV was a decoy, a short-term getaway vehicle. The real transport, the one that would take Lila farther, maybe out of the city, maybe even out of state, was somewhere else, already on the move. The woman's voice cut through the tension. I know why they took her. Ramirez turned sharply. What do you mean? The woman's hands trembled slightly as she pushed her hair back, her jaw tightening. My ex Lila's father. He got out of prison last month. Leo barely caught Ramirez's reaction, a flicker of realization, of urgency sharpening the already high-stakes situation, but he didn't need to see it to know what it meant. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. It was personal. Ramirez's partner didn't hesitate. He was already relaying the information, requesting details on the ex, checking parole records, pulling up anything that might connect him to known associates, past addresses, anything that could point to where they might be taking Lila. The woman's breathing was ragged, but her voice was clear, certain. If he took her, he's not planning on keeping her in the city. Leo turned to Ramirez. How fast can you lock down transit hubs? Ramirez's radio crackled before she could answer. A new voice, urgent. This is dispatch. Possible sighting, Penn Station. Security camera picked up a man carrying a child matching the description. Confirming details now. Leo didn't think. He ran. Leo barely heard Ramirez calling after him as he pushed through the laundromat doors and into the street, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He knew how this worked. Once a child was in a place like Penn Station, where thousands of people moved every minute, where exits led to subways, long-distance trains, cabs, buses, the odds of finding them dropped with every second that passed. The street was alive with noise, honking cabs, the murmur of tourists, the occasional street vendor shouting over the crowd, but he had already locked on to one thing, the distant glow of the station entrance. He sprinted. He had always been in good shape, but this was different. This wasn't training for a role, wasn't a scene where he could reset if things went wrong. He didn't care that people were turning their heads as he moved past them, barely registering the occasional, hey, watch it, as he maneuvered through the pedestrians clogging the sidewalk. Behind him, he heard Ramirez relaying information into her radio, catching up fast, but he didn't slow down. He could already see the steps leading down into the station, the wide entrance swallowing streams of people moving in all directions. He reached the main doors just as two uniformed officers came into view, one of them speaking into his shoulder radio while the other scanned the moving crowd. Leo didn't hesitate. Where? His breath was hard and fast, but he forced himself to stay clear, to focus. Security saw him. Where was he? One of the officers turned, eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized him, but to his credit, he didn't waste time on it. Lower level. Track 17. About 3 minutes ago. Security feed caught a man carrying a child, but we don't have a clear visual on the exit yet. 3 minutes. That was already too long. Leo took the stairs 2 at a time, Ramirez right on his heels, the sound of their steps lost in the echoing voices, the low hum of trains idling in the distance, the occasional crackle of announcements overhead. The lower level was worse than the main entrance, the crowd denser, people moving in different directions with the rushed energy of commuters trying to catch a train before the doors closed. The signs above the platforms flashed with departure times, destinations, everything blurring together as Leo scanned the crowd. Then he saw it. Not the man, not the child, but the smallest glimpse of pink. Near the far end of the platform, just past the thickest part of the crowd, a familiar pink jacket was disappearing through the train doors. Leo moved before he could think, pushing past the few people between him and the edge of the platform. Ramirez's voice sharp behind him. Leo, wait. He didn't wait. The train hadn't pulled out yet, but the doors were closing, the chime ringing out its warning. He threw himself forward, his hand shooting out between the metal doors just as they met, forcing them back open. The sudden resistance triggered a brief alarm, the irritated sighs of passengers barely registering as he stepped inside, his eyes locking onto the farthest end of the car. A man in a dark hoodie, seated near the back, his posture too controlled, his head turned just slightly away from the main aisle. And in his lap, the small, still frame of a child. Leo didn't move too fast, didn't make it obvious, but the second he took a step forward, the man shifted. Just enough. The doors slid shut behind him. For a split second, Leo felt the shift in the air, the moment the man realized someone had caught on to him. The train lurched forward, the motion sending a slight sway through the passengers, but Leo was locked in place. He knew if he lunged too soon, if he made it obvious, the man might do something reckless. He could feel the weight of Ramirez watching from the platform, knew she had already called it in, knew officers were likely scrambling to intercept the train at the next stop, but that wasn't soon enough. The man started to stand. Leo moved. He reached the man just as he turned, just as his arm curled tighter around the small girl in his lap, just as the first flicker of desperation crossed his face. He was in his 30s, maybe early 40s, unshaven, sharp features that might have once looked ordinary if not for the thin sheen of sweat now coating his skin. His free hand twitched toward his pocket. Leo didn't give him the chance. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting hard enough to send him stumbling back into his seat, the sharp sound of impact lost under the screech of the train against the tracks. People were turning now, realizing something was happening, but no one moved. The man grunted, trying to wrench himself free, but Leo had spent enough years on set working with stunt teams to know how to hold someone in place without making it easy for them to fight back. "You don't want to do this." Leo's voice was low, steady. He could feel the tension in the man's muscles, the last-second calculation happening behind those panicked eyes. The man shifted slightly, his fingers brushing against the fabric of his pocket again. Leo reacted before he could think, slamming him back against the seat with enough force to rattle the tray table. The movement jostled Lila just enough for her head to lift slightly, her sleepy eyes blinking in confusion. Leo tightened his grip. "Let her go." For a second, it looked like the man was considering his odds. Then, with a low, furious exhale, he uncurled his grip from Lila's waist. The moment she was free, Leo reached down, his hands careful but quick as he scooped her into his arms. She was small, lighter than he expected, her body limp with whatever drug was still running through her system. But she was breathing. She was here. The train jerked slightly as it slowed, the automated announcement overhead calling out the next station. Leo barely heard it over the rush of blood in his ears. The man moved again, one last desperate attempt to run. This time, Leo wasn't the one who stopped him. A pair of officers burst into the train car just as the doors opened, their voices sharp, their presence shifting the energy instantly. The man barely got half a step before he was yanked backward, the metallic snap of handcuffs locking into place the only thing breaking the momentary silence. Leo exhaled slowly. The little girl stirred slightly in his arms, her tiny fingers curling weakly against his jacket, her voice nothing more than a quiet, drowsy murmur. "Ethan." Leo felt something in his chest tighten. He adjusted his grip, his voice soft but certain. "You're going to see him soon."